Stella May's arrival at her sister Fiona's wedding was nothing short of surreal. The sprawling lakeside resort in Vermont shimmered in the early afternoon light, its manicured gardens bursting with white roses and peonies that looked too perfect to be real. She stepped out of her dusty sedan, the car's trunk still bearing a dent from a careless driver last winter, and tried not to let it dampen her spirit. The valet, dressed in a crisp black suit, greeted her with a polite but detached nod as he took the keys. Stella smoothed the soft blue dress she'd chosen for the occasion, a dress she'd owned for years, but had only worn twice, both times to weddings that weren't hers. The air was cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and lake water. She walked slowly down the stone path to the main entrance, her heels clicking in time with her quickening heartbeat. Inside the grand lobby, a hostess with a dazzling smile and hair pulled back in a sleek bun approached her. "Name, please," she asked in a voice as bright as the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Stella May," she said softly. The hostess's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she flipped through the elegant seating chart. Her fingers moved a bit too fast, and Stella felt her stomach drop when the hostess's smile returned, this time more strained than genuine. "Ah, yes. You're in the hallway area." Stella blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "The hallway," she repeated. The hostess's voice softened, almost apologetic. "Yes, just outside the banquet hall near the coat check." Stella's eyes darted to the ornate display beside them. Her parents, Margaret and Richard, were listed at the head table. Fiona and her groom, Victor Hart, were surrounded by friends, colleagues, and distant relatives. But Stella, she was nowhere to be seen. She pressed her lips together, willing her voice to stay steady. "I don't see my name inside," she said. The hostess only offered a sympathetic smile. "I'm afraid that's the arrangement." For a moment, the festive music and soft laughter from inside the hall felt like a world away. Stella's heart thudded in her chest. She took the small card with her name on it, printed in elegant gold script, and forced herself to smile. "Thank you," she murmured, even though she already knew this was just the beginning of a long night spent on the sidelines. Stella stood there, the hallway card in her hand, like a cruel joke. Her fingers tightened around the stiff paper, the elegant gold letters shimmering under the chandelier's glow. The music from the main hall drifted out in bright, buoyant waves, strings of laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, the low murmur of conversations she would never be a part of. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She could almost taste the sweetness of the wedding cake in the air, but she knew none of it was meant for her. She walked forward, the long train of her soft blue dress swishing against the polished marble floor. Each step felt heavy, deliberate, like she was walking a tightrope over a chasm she'd been told didn't exist. At the edge of the hallway, she caught sight of her mother, Margaret, adjusting Fiona's veil with meticulous care. The two of them looked like a magazine, spread Margaret's pale lilac dress, hugging her still slim figure, her hair twisted into a perfect chignon, a small smile playing on her lips as she fussed over her younger daughter. Fiona, resplendent in white lace and pearls, gave a small, satisfied smile that never quite reached her eyes. Stella paused, her throat tight. "Mom!" she said, her voice a thread of sound. Margaret didn't turn at first, too engrossed in smoothing a small wrinkle in Fiona's gown. "Mom," Stella said again, a little louder this time. Finally, Margaret glanced over, her expression tight with annoyance. "Stella, not now." "Can't you see we're in the middle of something?" Stella swallowed. "I just need a minute," she said softly. Margaret sighed, stepping back, as if she'd been inconvenienced by a child's question. Fiona's gaze flickered to Stella, her lips curling ever so slightly. Stella's pulse quickened. "I've been placed in the hallway," Stella said, her words calm but brittle like glass about to crack. "Near the coat check." Margaret's brows knit together for the briefest moment before her face smoothed out into polite indifference. "Yes, well, we had to prioritize close family. You understand." Stella stared at her. "I am close family," she said, her voice so quiet she almost didn't recognize it as her own. Margaret gave a small icy laugh that sliced through the space between them. "Oh, Stella, don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a seat." Fiona chimed in, then her voice honey-sweet, her eyes glinting with something far colder. It was probably just a last-minute mix-up, she said, each word dripping with condescension. Weddings are hectic, you know that. Stella turned her gaze back to her mother, searching for even a flicker of doubt of sympathy, anything that would tell her she wasn't invisible. But Margaret just shook her head, her lips pursed, as if she were already bored of the conversation. Don't ruin your sister's big day, Stella. Be grateful you were invited. That word grateful tasted like acid on Stella's tongue. Grateful to be treated like an afterthought. Grateful to be placed in the hallway like some distant cousin who barely made the cut. Before she could respond, her father Richard approached a tumbler of whiskey cradled in one hand. His dark eyes were focused on the floor as if he were already miles away from this conversation. It's just a seat, sweetheart, he said, his voice low and resigned. Don't make it into something it's not. Stella's lips twitched into a smile, small, brittle, and hollow. She nodded once, turning away without another word. They thought she would accept it like she always had. They thought she would swallow her pride and smile through the pain like she'd done at every holiday dinner and every forced family photo. But today, something inside her shifted. She stepped back into the hallway, her heels clicking lightly against the marble. The hallway was beautiful in its own right, soft lighting, polished floors, and a quiet hush that seemed to echo every footstep. But it was also a place for coats and umbrellas, not for family. She sank onto a small bench by the window, the chill from the glass seeping into her skin. Outside, the sun was sinking low, painting the lake in shades of gold and rose. She turned the place card over and over in her hand, each rotation a silent accusation. Stella May hallway area. Not inside, not welcome, not part of the picture. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her like a sudden tide. She remembered birthdays where Fiona was the star, candles and laughter, and Margaret's careful attention to every detail. She remembered Christmas mornings when she stood to the side, holding her breath for a moment of recognition that never came. She remembered the Thanksgiving 3 years ago when she had stumbled across the notebook in her mother's vanity page after page, filled with memories of Fiona. Ellie's first day of school. Ellie's favorite dinner. Ellie's fears and triumphs. Stella had searched those pages for her own name, for even a fleeting mention of who she was or what she'd meant to her mother. She found nothing. A small, humorless smile tugged at her lips. She had always been told she was independent, the one who didn't need attention or fuss. But today, staring at her reflection in the glass, she saw it for what it truly was, a convenient excuse, a story her family told themselves to justify leaving her in the shadows. Fiona's laughter rang out from the main hall, muffled but still cutting. Stella lifted her head, the weight in her chest heavy but no longer suffocating. She realized she was done waiting for someone to pull her from the sidelines. If this was where they thought she belonged, then she'd stop trying to prove them wrong. She would not beg for scraps of affection or force herself into a place that had never been hers to begin with. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, a new message from an old friend asking how the wedding was going. Stella stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down untouched. She didn't have the energy to explain what couldn't be summed up in a text. The truth was that she had spent her whole life trying to fit into a puzzle that was never meant for her. And for the first time, she was starting to see the outline of another path, one that didn't depend on where her family placed her at the table. She pushed herself up from the bench, her hand steady as she smoothed her dress. She took one last look at the hallway card before slipping it into her purse. In the grand hall, Fiona would be radiant, the center of every camera flash and whispered compliment. Margaret would beam at her younger daughter, Richard would drink quietly and pretend not to see, and the guests would never know the cracks beneath the surface. But Stella knew. She knew exactly who she was and exactly what she deserved. And as she turned to walk away from the coat racks and the hushed, polite hallway, she wasn't sure what the night would bring. But for the first time, she felt like it was hers to decide. Stella took one last, measured breath in the quiet hallway before she rose from the bench, her posture as resolute as the resolve hardening in her chest. She moved down the corridor heels, tapping out a muted rhythm that felt both final and freeing. Inside the main hall, the laughter and music rose and fell like an ocean tide, distant and indifferent to the quiet war she was fighting within herself. She paused near a gilded mirror, caught a glimpse of her reflection, shoulders squared, lips pressed into a determined line. The woman looking back at her was no longer the girl who would swallow hurt for the sake of peace. That girl was gone. And with that realization, Stella turned on her heel and headed toward the small lounge that overlooked the lake. She didn't expect to find anyone there, but the universe had a way of dealing unexpected hands. Victor Hart, the groom and soon-to-be husband of Fiona, was standing alone by the window, his posture tense, his silhouette framed by the shimmering lake outside. He looked almost statuesque in his tailored navy suit, but the way his fingers drummed nervously on the glass betrayed the storm raging in his head. Stella hesitated for a moment, the scent of white gardenias heavy in the air. She thought about turning back, about slipping into the shadows and letting this day run its course without her. But something in the set of Victor's shoulders stopped her. He turned when he heard her approach, his dark eyes searching hers, like he was trying to find something solid in a world that had suddenly turned to sand. "Stella," he said, his voice low and rough around the edges. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Stella managed a small, wry smile. "I could say the same about you." She watched as he lifted a half-empty champagne flute, his thumb whirring at the rim. "I needed a moment to breathe," he said simply. Stella nodded, understanding all too well. She moved closer, stopping just short of the window. The lake outside was a sheet of liquid gold under the setting sun, as if the world beyond this wedding still held hope she could barely remember. Victor's gaze drifted back to her, his brows pulling together. "You seem different today," he said. "Like you're done playing along." Stella gave a soft laugh that held no humor. "Maybe because I am." He studied her face for a moment, then let out a breath. "Can I ask you something? And I need you to be honest." She held his gaze, feeling the weight of his words press against her ribs. "Of course," she said quietly. He paused like he was measuring each word before he let it go. "Has Fiona ever said anything to you about me, about us, things that didn't sit right?" Stella's breath caught memories of half-heard conversations and cutting remarks flickering through her mind. Fiona's sweet, venomous voice, dripping with scorn and superiority, echoed in her ears. "Victor, why are you asking me this now?" she said carefully, though her pulse quickened. He ran a hand through his hair, the carefully styled waves coming undone with the motion. "Because lately, things haven't felt right," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's been different, controlling, secretive, and I don't know if I'm imagining it or if I'm finally seeing the truth." Stella's throat tightened. She thought of the way Fiona had laughed when she'd seen Stella's name card, the way she had dismissed her so easily. She thought of all the times Fiona had turned their parents' love into a weapon, wielding it against Stella, without a second thought. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "I think." "You're not imagining it," she said softly. Victor's shoulders slumped, the truth hitting him like a blow. "What did she say to you?" he asked, his voice strained. Stella looked away, her fingers playing with the delicate clasp of her purse. "Little things, nothing outright but enough to see her for who she really is," she admitted. "She's always been careful with her words, but there's always something underneath them, something that cuts." Victor exhaled a sound halfway between relief and despair. I needed to hear that he murmured, because part of me thought I was losing my mind. Stella's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to tell him that she understood more than anyone else in that hall. She understood what it was to question your own worth because of someone else's poison. But the words caught in her throat, too heavy to voice. A quiet moment settled between them, the hush of the lounge wrapping them in a bubble of fragile truth. Outside, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. Victor turned back to the window, his fingers tightening around the glass. Do you think, do you think she even cares about me? Or was I just another box to check on her perfect list? Stella reached out her hand, hovering over his arm for a moment before she let it fall. I think she cares about how it all looks, she said honestly. But I don't know if she knows how to care about you. Victor's eyes closed, a muscle ticking in his jaw. That's what I was afraid of. The door to the lounge opened, then a soft click that felt almost jarring in the stillness. Stella turned to see Evelyn Hart, Victor's mother, step inside. She was a vision of quiet power, her navy gown hugging her frame, her platinum hair swept back in a severe bun. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, landed first on Victor, then shifted to Stella. I thought I might find you here, she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that brooked no argument. Victor straightened slightly, the exhaustion in his shoulders giving way to something harder. Mother, he said, his tone formal. Evelyn's gaze softened, only a fraction. I know you're struggling, she said quietly, but there are things you need to see. Things you've been kept from. She held up a sleek phone, the screen glowing faintly in the low light. Stella felt the air around them shift, a current of dread and possibility, crackling in the silence. Victor reached for the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he took it from her. Stella watched as his eyes scanned the screen, his brows pulling together in confusion that quickly gave way to something darker, hurt disbelief, then cold, hard clarity. She said all this, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Evelyn nodded once. She told her friend she was training you to be the perfect husband, she said evenly, and that as long as she played the sweet, devoted wife, everything you had would be hers. Victor's hand tightened around the phone, the glass of his champagne flute forgotten on the windowsill. Stella felt her own breath catch the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. She thought of Fiona's saccharine smile, the way she wielded charm like a blade, and felt a shiver run through her. Victor looked up, his eyes meeting Stella's. There was pain there, raw and unguarded, but also a spark of something else, resolve. I'm done pretending, he said softly, and in that moment, Stella believed him. She nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing for certain: the facade was crumbling, and with it, the fragile illusions that had kept them all prisoners. The lounge had grown colder as Victor read the messages on his mother's phone, each word a fresh betrayal that cut deeper than the last. Evelyn stood silent and steady, her hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder, as if she alone could keep him from sinking under the weight of the truth. Stella watched Victor's face, the way his eyes darkened with every revelation. She had seen this look before on her own face in the mirror, on nights when she realized that family could wound you in ways no stranger ever could. Victor lowered the phone, his fingers gripping it like it was the only thing anchoring him to the floor. She planned it all, he said quietly, his voice raw and shaking. Even the divorce. Evelyn nodded slowly. The consultation papers were filed last month, she said, her tone as calm as the surface of the lake outside. She never planned to build a life with you. She planned to take it. A long silence fell between them. Stella could feel the air shift, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Finally, Victor turned to Stella, his eyes searching hers for something, strength perhaps, or simply someone to witness the shattering of everything he thought he knew. I believed her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought she chose me because she loved me. Stella's heart ached with a dull, familiar throb. She reached out her fingers, brushing lightly against his arm. We all want to believe the best in the people we love, she said softly. But sometimes, they just aren't who we thought they were. Victor nodded, once his jaw tight. I need to talk to her, he said, the decision settling into his shoulders like armor. I need to hear her say it. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't argue. She's in the bridal suite with your father, she said. I'll bring her here. She turned to leave, her movements precise and controlled, and Stella felt a flicker of admiration for the older woman's quiet strength. As the door clicked shut behind her, Victor let out a long, ragged breath. He set the phone down on the low table beside them and stared out the window, the lake now a deep blue under the gathering dusk. Stella sat beside him, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. She didn't speak. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't sound like a platitude. Instead, she offered him her quiet presence, a promise that he wasn't alone in the moment his world fell apart. When the door opened again, the shift in the room was immediate. Fiona entered first, her posture, as regal as ever, her wedding gown flowing around her like a river of ivory and lace. She wore the same practiced smile that had charmed so many before, but today it faltered at the edges, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as she took in the sight of Victor and Stella waiting for her. Behind her, Richard, Stella's father, hovered in the doorway, his brow furrowed, his mouth a thin line of worry. Evelyn stood a few steps back, her arms folded across her chest, her expression unreadable. "What is this?" Fiona asked, her voice high and brittle, her gaze darting from Victor to Stella. "Why are you pulling people out of the wedding? We're supposed to be celebrating, not enough," Victor said, his tone soft but final. He rose from the couch, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "We need to talk." Fiona's eyes widened, a flash of something fear, maybe crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "Victor, this is ridiculous," she said, her laugh too sharp to be real. "Whatever this is, we can discuss it later. There's 100 guests out there. They can wait." Victor said, his voice steady. He reached for the phone, holding it out to her. "Read them," he said. "Every word." Fiona's smile froze on her lips. She didn't reach for the phone, didn't even glance at it. Instead, her gaze shifted to Richard, her voice taking on a pleading edge. "Dad, tell them this is nonsense," she said, her tone so sweet it could have rotted in the air. Richard looked at her, his eyes clouded with something Stella couldn't name. "Fiona, is it true?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. Fiona's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing. "You're all turning on me," she said, her voice rising. "Over what, some messages between friends? They don't mean anything." Victor's hand dropped to his side, his shoulders stiff. "Don't insult me, Fiona," he said quietly. "Don't insult yourself. We both know exactly what those words meant." Fiona's hands clenched at her sides, her perfect French manicure digging into her palms. "You don't understand," she snapped, her composure slipping like silk on marble. "I did everything for us. I wanted to make sure we had a future, a real future, by planning to leave me before the ink was even dry on our marriage license." Victor asked, his voice as cold and sharp as winter air. "By using me," Fiona's mouth opened, then closed, words dying in her throat. She turned to Richard again, her eyes wide and desperate. "Dad, please." But Richard shook his head, his expression hollow. "Fiona, I don't even know who you are anymore," he said quietly. Stella watched her sister's face crumble, the cracks spiderwebbing through the flawless facade she had built so carefully. For a moment, Fiona stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her eyes wild. Then she turned on Stella, her voice low and venomous. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You've always been jealous of me, always waiting for me to fail." Stella met her gaze calmly, her heart steady in her chest. "No," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "This isn't about me, it's about you. And what you did." Fiona let out a sharp, bitter laugh, the sound brittle as glass. "You think you're so perfect, don't you?" she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You've always wanted to take everything from me, my place, my family, my future." Stella shook her head slowly, the ache in her chest almost tender. "I don't want what's yours, Fiona," she said. "I just don't want to be invisible anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. Fiona's shoulders sagged, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Evelyn stepped forward, her voice as calm and final as a closing door. "It's time to end this," she said. She turned to Victor, her eyes softening. "You don't have to decide now, but you do have to decide." Victor nodded, once his face pale but resolute. "I've already decided," he said, his voice firm. "This marriage ends tonight. And in that instant, Stella realized that this wasn't just the unraveling of a wedding. It was the unraveling of every quiet lie they had all been told to believe. And for the first time, she felt the weight of it lift from her shoulders, like a chain she hadn't even known she was carrying. The war was over, and she had chosen herself. Fiona's eyes darted around the lounge as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The truth was, out the illusions shattered, and the walls she had built for so long were finally crumbling around her. Stella watched as her sister's shoulders squared in one last attempt to regain control, her jaw set in that familiar, defiant tilt. But the gleam of triumph that had always been in her eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow and lost. Victor stood silently, his hand still clutching the phone that held Fiona's betrayal in digital ink. Evelyn's gaze was steady and unwavering, her silent strength filling the room like a cold breeze. Richard leaned heavily against the doorframe, his face pale, the lines of worry etched deeper than Stella had ever seen before. The quiet in the room was suffocating, a fragile pause before the storm. Fiona's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. And then, with a sudden flick of her veil, she turned and strode out of the room, her gown billowing behind her like a ghost's train. Stella's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. She knew where Fiona was headed. She was going back to the one place she had always craved, the spotlight, the main hall, the reception that was still in full swing, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the quiet corners of the resort. Victor's hand dropped to his side, his knuckles white around the phone. "We need to stop her," he said, his voice low. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "No," she said quietly. "Let her go. Let her show everyone exactly who she is." Stella felt a chill run down her spine, but she understood. Some truths didn't need to be whispered behind closed doors. They needed to be seen. She followed Victor and Evelyn as they left the lounge, Richard trailing behind them with a hesitant step. The soft strains of a string quartet drifted from the main hall, a bittersweet melody that seemed to mock the turmoil in Stella's heart. As they approached the heavy double doors, she could already hear Fiona's voice, sharp and demanding, cutting through the polite laughter of the crowd. The doors swung open, and for a moment the scene beyond looked exactly as it should have, a vision of celebration and opulence. White tablecloths glowed under the warm light of the chandeliers, crystal glasses sparkled in every hand, and the scent of fresh roses filled the air. But at the center of it all, Fiona stood like a dark star. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes wild. Her veil was askew, the delicate lace trembling with each shaky breath she took. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" she shouted, her voice ringing out over the quiet murmur of the guests. "After everything I've done, after everything I've given," the music stopped, the bow of the violinist frozen in midair. Heads turned, eyes widening in confusion and curiosity. Stella felt the weight of every gaze, the way the room seemed to tilt around Fiona's fury. Victor stepped forward, his presence calm and resolute, and for a moment there was a hush that felt like the whole world holding its breath. "No one humiliated you, Fiona," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You did this to yourself." Fiona's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You think you're better than me?" she spat, her voice cracking. "You think you're so perfect standing there with your smug little truths?" Victor shook his head slowly, sadness softening the hard line of his mouth. "I think I deserved better than lies," he said. "And I think everyone here deserves to know who you really are." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, the gentle clink of glassware, like the faintest echo of thunder. Stella could see the realization dawning on faces, guests who had once cheered for Fiona's charm, who had admired her radiant smile and effortless grace. Now they saw the cracks, the desperation that had always lurked beneath the surface. Fiona's gaze darted around the room, searching for an ally, someone to tell her this was all a bad dream. But no one stepped forward. Even Margaret, standing stiffly by the head table, looked at her daughter with something like shock in her eyes. For the first time, Stella saw her mother finally seeing Fiona not as the perfect daughter, but as a woman who had played them all for fools. The silence stretched thick and heavy, and then Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but sharp as glass. "I once hoped you would be part of this family," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "But you never wanted that. You only wanted what you could take." Fiona let out a strangled sound, her hands fisting in the delicate fabric of her dress. "That's not true," she shouted, tears streaking the careful makeup on her cheeks. "You're all turning on me. You're all trying to ruin me." Stella stepped forward, then her heart steady despite the chaos. "No, Fiona," she said, her voice clear. "You ruined yourself. We're just done pretending otherwise." The words landed with the weight of finality, and Fiona staggered back, as if struck. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her breath ragged. Then, in a sudden rush of movement, she turned and ran through the crowd, past the stunned faces and the silent judgment of every guest who had once believed in her perfect story. Stella watched as the doors swung shut behind her, the echo of her footsteps fading into the quiet that followed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The music didn't start again. The air was thick with a new kind of electricity, the crackle of truth that had finally been set free. Victor let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping, as if he had been holding them up for far too long. Evelyn rested a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. Richard stepped closer to Stella, his eyes meeting hers with a kind of quiet apology that said more than words ever could. And then, as if released from a spell, the guests began to stir, soft murmurs, uneasy glances, the clink of glasses set down too quickly. Stella felt the weight of it all pressing on her chest, but she also felt something else, a lightness, a freedom she hadn't known she was missing. She turned away from the scene, her breath steady, her eyes bright with the certainty that there was no going back. Fiona's reign of perfect illusions was over, and in its place, Stella saw the outlines of something new, a life not defined by someone else's lies, but by her own quiet courage. As she stepped away from the center of the room, the gentle strains of music finally began again. But this time, it felt different, like the softest exhale after a storm. Stella didn't know what came next, but for the first time, she was ready to find out. The soft strains of the string quartet floated back into the air, but Stella barely heard them. She moved through the hall slowly, as if each step was a quiet reckoning. Around her, the wedding had begun to settle into an uneasy calm, guests exchanging hushed words, some darting glances at her, as if they were only now noticing she was there. She didn't mind the looks she had spent most of her life feeling invisible at gatherings like these. Today, that invisibility was gone, not because she had forced herself into the light, but because the truth had finally cracked open the perfect facade her family had clung to for so long. She paused near a table by the window, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. Outside, the lake was a sheet of black glass under the night sky, stars winking down like distant promises. She remembered standing at this same window hours ago, clutching the place card that had told her exactly where she belonged, in their plans on the edge in the shadows. Now she felt no need to hold on to it anymore. She slipped it from her purse and laid it on the table, watching the gold letters catch the soft glow of the chandelier one last time. It felt like letting go of something she'd carried for far too long. Richard approached quietly, his steps careful. He looked older than she remembered, the lines in his face, deeper, the stoop in his shoulders more pronounced. "Stella," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't quite know how to share. She turned to him, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a moment, he seemed to search her face, as if he was trying to see the little girl he had once known, and maybe never really understood. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words heavy but sincere. "I was wrong to let this happen to you, to let them treat you like you didn't matter." His voice broke on the last word. Stella swallowed her own throat tight. "I know," she said softly, "but I'm not waiting for an apology anymore." He nodded slowly, a flash of pain, and something like relief crossing his features. "I understand," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it from me." She gave him a small, sad smile. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't time yet for that, but it was something. A quiet acknowledgement of the weight they had both carried for too long. He stepped back, and she watched him walk away, his head bowed, as if the enormity of what had happened tonight had finally sunk in. Stella turned back to the window, her reflection caught between the world outside and the glittering chaos inside. In the glass, she didn't see the girl who had always tried so hard to please, who had twisted herself into shapes that never fit. She saw a woman who had stopped asking to be chosen and had chosen herself instead. The night moved on around her. Evelyn and Victor were speaking quietly near the dance floor, their heads bent close together. The guests were trying to salvage the evening laughter, forced and brittle at the edges. Fiona was nowhere to be seen, the door she'd fled through, still slightly ajar, as if the air itself hadn't quite caught up with her departure. Stella didn't wonder where her sister was. She had spent years wondering about Fiona, trying to understand the cruelty that always hid behind her charm. Tonight she realized that understanding wasn't hers to claim. Some people built their lives on lies so carefully that even the truth couldn't touch them until it did. A waiter paused near her, offering her a glass of champagne. Stella hesitated, then took it, the bubbles rising in the golden liquid, like tiny sparks of defiance. She lifted the glass, not in a toast to anyone else, but as a quiet promise to herself. She sipped it slowly, the dry taste a reminder that even bitter things could be beautiful in their own way. Margaret appeared at the edge of her vision, her face pale, and her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, their eyes met mother and daughter, bound by blood, but separated by so much more. Margaret took a step forward, her mouth opening as if to speak, but Stella shook her head gently. "Not now," she said quietly. "I need space." Margaret's shoulders sagged, and she turned away without another word. Stella watched her go, feeling a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Regret loss. Or maybe just the final thread of a tie that had frayed long before tonight. She moved away from the window, weaving through the clusters of guests until she reached the doors that led to the quiet outside. The air was crisp and cool against her skin, the scent of lake water and night-blooming flowers, fresh and real, in a way that the perfumed air of the banquet hall could never be. She stepped out onto the stone terrace, the soft glow of fairy lights strung along the railings, casting gentle shadows across the marble. Here, away from the music and the polite murmurs of the crowd, she could finally hear the rhythm of her own heart. Stella sat on a low stone bench, her champagne glass resting lightly against her knee. She let her thoughts drift like the ripples across the lake's surface. Tonight had been a reckoning, a brutal, necessary unveiling of all the quiet betrayals that had shaped her life. But it had also been a kind of liberation. She had spent so long believing that love meant bending herself into the shape of someone else's expectations. That to be seen meant to be perfect, to be silent when it mattered most. But tonight had taught her something else. Love wasn't about how many times you could forgive someone for making you small. It was about refusing to be small in the first place. She realized then that she wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even sad. She was done letting other people's shadows define the shape of her own light. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, the cold night air filling her lungs, clearing out the last of the doubt and fear. When she opened her eyes, the lake stretched out before her, calm and endless, and she felt something inside her open to match it, a quiet, steady certainty that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The glass in her hand caught the light, the bubbles rising and breaking like tiny, fleeting fireworks. She thought of how easily things could seem to shatter, how even the most fragile glass could still reflect the brilliance of the world around it. She raised the glass slightly, a silent toast to herself, to the woman she had always been beneath the weight of everyone else's expectations. She didn't need their forgiveness. She didn't need their validation. And most of all, she didn't need their love to feel worthy. She had found her own worth in the quiet courage of choosing herself, and in the steadfast conviction that she didn't need to be seated at the head table to belong in her own life. The music from inside rose softly, carrying on the wind like a lullaby. But Stella stayed seated in the quiet night, the stars reflected in her eyes. She was done with the shadows. She was ready for her own light. The dawn crept in, slowly, soft golden light, washing over the calm lake like a promise of something new. Stella watched it from her small apartment in Boston, her window cracked open to the gentle hush of the early morning. The wedding was behind her now, a memory that felt both raw and strangely weightless in the quiet of this new day. She thought about how she had left the reception, how she had walked away from the cold marble and clinking glasses, from the strained smiles and half-truths, and had not looked back. In that moment of stepping into the night, she had felt something shift deep inside her, like a final thread snapping free. She didn't know exactly what the future would hold. She wasn't sure where each step would lead, or how the echoes of that night might linger in the corners of her heart. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to know. The need to plan every moment so that no one could accuse her of failing. The need to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's story. She was done with that. She was ready to write her own. A week later, she booked a trip to Maine. Just a small cabin by the water, a chance to sit still and feel the steady thrum of her own heartbeat without anyone else's noise pressing in. She knew her family might never understand why she had walked away that night. They might never see her choice as anything but an act of defiance. But she was done living for their understanding. Her life was hers. Her peace was hers. And she intended to guard it fiercely. Stella stood in her kitchen, the soft glow of the morning sun warming her face, and she smiled. The quiet was no longer something she feared. It was a gentle reminder that she had survived the storm and had found something stronger than approval on the other side. She raised her coffee mug to the dawn, feeling the weight of her own strength. This was the beginning she had always needed. Have you ever felt the moment when you finally chose yourself? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for more stories that remind us real strength begins the day we stop asking for permission to live.